Dark impulses lurk beneath the surface of all of us. Without warning, they can emerge, unleashing a monster from within. Meadowvale is a peaceful working-class suburb of Toronto. A place to raise a family, where neighbors look out for one another. There's a great park nearby where kids can safely hang out. And in the heart of the park is Lake Aquitaine, named after the famous Scottish lake, which is said to be haunted by the Loch Ness Monster. As darkness falls, the park is particularly inviting for teenagers. But all that changes one balmy spring night. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours.
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
April 30th, 1998. 3 teenage girls have been questioned by police for hours about attacks on them earlier that night. The series of assaults began with Jennifer and her girlfriend walking home through the park around 8 p.m.
We saw this guy on a bike. He didn't really think too much, so we kept walking. And my friend said, "Turn around, tell me if that guy's following us." So I turned around and I said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, he is following us."
He approached the girls and propositioned them, offering them $20 for sex. When they told him to forget it, he exposed himself and started masturbating in front of them.
When I saw him masturbating, I was freaked out. It wasn't funny at all. It was completely a shock.
Martha, the victim of a second assault, reports an even scarier encounter to the police. It was about 11 p.m. She too had been approached by a man on a bicycle who demanded sex for money. She told him to get lost. This got the guy riled. He grabbed her, wouldn't let up. But she was able to break away before he could do any further harm. Martha wasn't the last one assaulted tonight. There's been another victim. But this woman wasn't able to get away. The attack on her escalated to a violent rape. The investigation has been assigned to Detective Blaise Dougherty, who's just finished interviewing the latest victim, Rachel.
All the girls that we dealt with that evening were between 15 and 17, very young, and certainly something like this was a traumatic event for them. The oldest girl that I dealt with, 17, she'd been through the most that evening. The 17-year-old girl had been violently attacked and punched, and during the attack, her glasses had been knocked off and smashed.
Rachel was brutally raped. Semen samples have been taken from her for potential DNA identification of the attacker. Because the assaults were all committed in a similar way by a young man on a bicycle, Detective Dougherty is convinced that the same person committed all 3 crimes. Police need to act fast. This predator's dangerous, going from flashing to rape in one night. They call on a sketch artist to draw a composite portrait of the offender.
She was able to give us a very, very good description, even though it had been dark out. Was that of a male. He was white, between 19 and 23 years of age, fairly slender build. He was a little bit scruffy appearance. Any situation where there's a serial sex offender at large, then obviously the stakes are much higher. We have an obligation as investigators to identify this guy as quickly as possible for the purposes of protecting the community.
By the next day, the media have picked up the story and informed Meadowvale residents that there's a rapist on the prowl. The composite sketch of the suspect and a Crime Stoppers tip number are posted. Police dub the predator they're now hunting the Loch Ness Monster. The response from the community is overwhelming.
People would call in and say, look, I have a neighbor who looks like this guy, or I know a guy who's got a history of this type, and he's someone that you should be looking at.
Police have to follow up on every one of these leads. They bring in more officers to help, including Detective Rob Shear.
I was involved in the canvass, and an area canvass is one of the single most important aspects of an investigation. Virtually every suspect that we encountered could have been a viable culprit for this crime.
Hi, sir.
The descriptions were closely matched. The area was basically a buzz of activity. And the community became very involved in trying to help us catch the person responsible.
People are on round-the-clock alert, watching out for unusual behavior in their neighborhood. 72 hours into the investigation, police are getting a growing list of tips.
I know that there are people that took it upon themselves to walk around the park, checking people out and making telephone calls to the police if they saw anyone suspicious.
I mean, even friends of mine had said, oh, I know a guy that looks like that, and oh, that could be this guy.
They say in the world everybody's got a double or a twin. There was a number of people in the Meadowvale area that looked a lot like the composite drawing.
Hey, he's over there! He's over there!
Some of these guys were being approached by people that lived around them and said, hey, you look like that rapist guy. Initially, when I saw the composite drawing, I looked at it and said, okay, this guy is distinctive enough that we're gonna have a fairly small list of suspects. I was wrong. We were up to 312 people who looked like the composite drawing.
They are looking for a needle in a haystack, and the haystack keeps getting bigger. Time is running out. Serial sex offenders often strike with perverse regularity. How long do they have before the Loch Ness Monster strikes again? The community of Meadowvale, especially the teenage victims, have been terrorized by a sexual predator. Rachel, the victim of rape, has been devastated. The community is on edge. They see suspects everywhere. Almost 2 months after the night of sexual frenzy, there have been no further reports of assaults in Meadowvale. But police are very aware the Loch Ness Monster could strike at any time. In an effort to narrow their search from over 300 suspects, investigators bring in behavioral profiler Jim Van Allen. His first task is to develop an unknown offender profile.
There was an individual who was obviously targeting this one geographic area, who was motivated by his sexually deviant needs. He was engaging in acts of exhibitionism to the women. He was making verbal proposals to engage in sexual acts in exchange for money. These weren't angry comments. To me, they reflected an unsophisticated offender, a very impulsive and brazen offender. It's believed that only 15% of these people will ever escalate to the more serious hands-on sexual assaults. The impulsive type of behavior exhibited during the incidents strongly suggested to me that this individual would go on and repeat serious sexual offenses and likely continue until he was caught.
Police now fear that the Loch Ness Monster could even turn deadly. Investigators learn from Van Allen that the man they're looking for is what's known as a power reassurance rapist, someone who feels powerless in their own life or relationship and who needs to assert themselves against someone weaker.
The repeated approaches, even during the same night, sometimes minutes apart, suggested, in terms of intelligence or intellect, this person would likely be scored as normal, perhaps slightly below normal, but there was no real sophistication to the crime.
While this helps police eliminate some of the suspects, behavioral profiling is just one piece of the puzzle. Investigators then consult Geographic profiler Brad Moore.
The investigators were hoping that I could provide them with an area that they should start to look for the offender and basically his base of operations. His choice of locations to commit his crimes says a lot about the offender. The fact that he chose just these trails as opposed to looking for victims on streets or in shopping plazas or other locations told me that he was comfortable in this area.
A key principle of geographic profiling is what's known as distance decay.
The basic premise behind distance decay is that people do more things closer to home than they do further from home, and businesses use it to decide where to put a new franchise. But it also applies to criminals. Criminals also tend to generally behave according to distance decay.
The restaurant one.
Sexual predators exhibit certain hunting patterns in their geographic territory. Brad Moore tracks these patterns with the help of a software program, preparing what he calls a Jeopardy surface.
It divides the hunting area, or the area of all the crime sites, into 40,000 individual squares, and it assigns a number to it. It takes that grid and assigns elevations based on those numbers and displays it as a Jeopardy surface. And that surface looks very much like a mountain range. The higher you get on the mountain, the more likely it is that the offender lives in that area. If they have a list of persons of interest, they would prioritize those that live closer to the peak first for further follow-up. Remembering it's not an X marks a spot, it doesn't mean that the guy at the top of the list is your bad guy. It just means that that is, based on geography, the best guy to start with.
With the help of Brad Moore and Jim Van Allen, police are able to eliminate more than 2/3 of the suspects, but that still leaves over 100. After police factor in the composite sketch and those people whose alibis don't hold up, they are left with a list of 18 suspects.
All of the top 18 looked very close to the composite drawing. They all lived in the area or worked in the area. They all had criminal histories with us.
How can they go from these 18 suspects to one guilty man? The DNA of the semen samples taken from the rape victim could provide the key. The Forensic Center finally calls in to say that they have a DNA profile of the rapist. It's now nearly 3 months since the crime, and police need to compare the DNA taken from the semen on the rape victim to the DNA of their suspects. They start with their top 4. The first suspect is John B. When the detectives come calling, his girlfriend says he isn't home.
From the very beginning, he was one of the top 4 that we looked at.
He has numerous outstanding warrants and has recently been fired from his job.
This individual had been around quite a bit, was very streetwise.
Shortly after police left, he calls them, claiming he has just arrived at home. They felt he was lying.
No, I just got in outside.
The second suspect, Eric R., is a transient who spends a lot of time in the park. He's even been known to sleep there some nights. He has a minor criminal record and no alibi for the night in question. The third suspect, Paul W., has been known to follow girls in the neighborhood. Some girls seem to like him, while others report there's something creepy about him. Police discover that his sister moved out of their family's home after filing a report that he'd molested her. The fourth suspect, Marvin P., had come to police attention based on a Crime Stoppers tip. When police decide to interview him at home, they discover he has moved out of the neighborhood and back in with his ex-girlfriend on the other side of town. Like some of the other suspects, he looks quite different from when he was originally interviewed.
Some of these guys, they cut their hair, they grew mustaches and beards, everything short of the Groucho Marx glasses to try and convince people that, it's not them.
Marvin P. and the three other suspects are brought in for further questioning. Is one of them the rapist? Or is the Loch Ness Monster still out there, about to slip through their net? To solve a brutal rape in the midst of a vibrant community, police have brought in their top 4 suspects. They need to get samples of their DNA. The first suspect, John B., knows the system well. He doesn't trust police and claims he'll be framed. But detectives convince him that because of his outstanding warrants, it's in his best interests to cooperate. The second suspect, Eric R., feels that giving a DNA sample is an invasion of his privacy. But he reluctantly agrees for fear of appearing guilty. The third suspect, Paul W., realizes it might make him look suspicious, but he adamantly refuses to let police take his DNA. He won't tell them why. The fourth suspect, Marvin P., appears shy but direct. Police have discovered that he was once arrested for robbery and served 6 months. He readily gives a blood sample for his DNA. The 4 suspects are released, but since Paul W. was the only one who refused to give a blood sample, investigators put him under surveillance.
Deviant, sexually motivated offenders really don't stop. If they're feeling that they're under a lot of suspicion or the circumstances in their life changes, it might be easier for them to control their impulses, but they're never really gone.
In a matter of days, the lab gets back to police with the DNA analysis.
Detective Dougherty answered his cell phone, and I could hear part of the conversation coming across the telephone, and that there had been a match, and it was probably one of the happiest days of my life. There's a real charge to knowing that you've finally caught the person that you've been hunting for the last 3 months.
Police arrest the rapist and bring him down to the station. This is the story he tells. It all started around the time of the breakup with his girlfriend, a period of high stress. This concurs with the profile constructed by Van Allen.
It's not unusual at all for these people to wait until some peak period of stress in their life to go out and commit their offenses. And this is a way that they can attempt to rebalance their life and make themselves feel better about themselves.
Sex crimes of this nature are all about power and control. Very little has to do with actual sex. He's just a person that needed to exert that type of power and control over female victims, and that's what made him feel better.
After his first pathetic attempt to entice the girls into sex failed, this powerless man became more bold. When Martha came along, he had built up his nerve to attempt a physical attack. By the time Rachel appeared, he had worked himself into a sexual frenzy. Marvin Payne needed to have absolute power, and he found it in rape. Payne thought he could get away with his violent attack, but the DNA sample collected from the victim in the first 72 hours gave him away. Half a year later, Payne is convicted of aggravated sexual assault and is sentenced to 10 years in prison.
I said to him, why, if you had done this, why did you give us your blood sample? And his response was that he thought the whole thing was just going to blow over. In his mind, he hoped it was going to blow over.
I was really happy for the sentence, but it still worries me that sometime he could come back.
While the community of Meadowvale may now be a safer place, each of the victims still lives with the memories of that night, the memories of the Loch Ness Monster. No one believes in ghosts until they encounter one. Almont, Ontario, a tranquil farming community, claim to fame, birthplace of the man who invented basketball. A place with a community spirit epitomized by volunteer fire brigade captain Art Brown.
Everybody knows your brother, your sister, your father, your aunt, your uncle, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and everybody cares about each other.
But in the summer of 2002, the peace of this trusting community is suddenly shattered. Someone is setting fires. Someone who strikes without being seen. An arsonist who will become known as the Ghost. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours. July 3rd, 2002. Earl and Marilyn Snedden are closing up their barn for the evening, never imagining their night is just beginning.
The first fire was discovered about 7:30 in the evening. So then we rushed over with hoses and pails and stuff and called the fire department.
The Almont Volunteer Fire Brigade answers the call. In living rooms throughout the community, fire radios crackle out the location. The Snedden farm just outside of town. The wall of a barn is smoldering and could catch fire at any moment. Fortunately, the volunteers will put it out before it spreads. In the barn, Fire Chief Art Brown finds a road flare, what any car owner might carry to light up an accident scene at night. It's also the perfect tool for an arsonist, because a road flare is like a long burning match.
You light them, they give you 20 minutes before they're completely burnt. So maybe from the time he's setting them, it's giving them time to get away.
After the sun goes down, under the cover of darkness, at the very same barn,
2 o'clock in the morning, a couple of truck drivers stopped and started banging on the door and got the dog shouting at us, and we get up out of bed and look out the window and we see about a 60-foot blaze. Unless you've experienced, I don't think you really know what it feels like to look out your window and see a fire like that so close to your house.
When I left my house, I just come onto the highway and I could see the glow in the sky.
I guess it's the biggest terror I've ever felt. You just sort of feel kind of numb because there isn't anything you can really do except stand there and watch.
The men fighting this fire are all local heroes. No matter what's going on in their personal lives, they show up.
Stop, what's wrong? This dog's loose.
Every man has earned a handle. Scarface Rollins was scorched in a car fire. Macho Man Mackenzie once punched his way through a burning wall. Smiley Edwards keeps smiling no matter what. Retired fireman Gibby Drummond once pulled Art Brown from a burning building. After 5 hours, the firefighters and the farmers admit defeat and start looking for answers.
They knew it was arson the first time, and we pretty well figured it had to be the second time.
The arsonist's assault on Almont isn't over. It's just beginning. "72 hours after the first fire, 3 buildings are charred rubble, and local police have yet to uncover a single suspect.
You must be dealing with a ghost because nobody seems to see anything. If they did see something, they didn't realize they'd seen something. People were very nervous. They were, especially farmers, they were scared to leave home.
To an insurance adjuster, these smoldering timbers are property damage. But to a farmer, the loss goes deeper. Barns are essential for a farmer's livestock, livelihood, and the health of the entire community. Farmers begin locking doors and boarding up windows. The trusting community is changing.
You hated to become that paranoid and that suspicious, but that's really what the whole community became before the summer was over.
The ghost continues to strike, unseen. The firefighters respond to call after call.
We worked all day, and then we get a call about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and we're out all night fighting this fire, and they had to go back to their regular jobs the next day. I think I had one stretch there at 39 hours without any sleep, so you're just going on adrenaline now. So it took a toll.
Always one step behind the fire setter. The men are dangerously exhausted, but they know they have to stay focused if they are to defeat the arsonist and save their community. Somehow, Art Brown and his volunteers keep going, and so does the ghost. Earl Snedden is horrified to see smoke coming out of his second barn, a cattle barn.
But we still don't know why he picked on us, or whether it was just because the building was so close to the road and an old building that was easy to get started.
He tries to fight the fire alone.
I was trying to ask my 65-year-old legs to move like I was still 20, and they couldn't do it, and so my hamstring got pulled and my leg let me collapse to the pavement. I couldn't hardly move because of the hamstring, and trying to get the fire out, and somehow we managed to hop over the fence and we got it under control.
During the first 3 weeks of July, Almont farmers endure 10 major barn fires. Realizing they can't catch the arsonist alone, local police call for help. It arrives on July 25th, a regional task force headed by Detective Gary Dougherty.
We connected fires number 1 through 5, 6, and 7, because what we were finding is that they were occurring primarily in the evening, primarily in a very tight radius. We were recovering some evidence of road flares.
The targets are all old barns accessible by road. None are near where people live. A pattern is emerging in the ghost's movements.
The frustration was, why can't somebody see them? I mean, why aren't we getting information coming in that would identify a vehicle, that would identify a person?
As tension and fear increases in the community, the arsonist does something no one expects. He changes his pattern. August 4th. Not a barn, but a house on the edge of town. A house owned by a longtime Almont resident, Jimmy Grace. A passerby spots smoke.
We're called out to the Grace Fire, and I can tell you on my arrival, I was worried. I looked at this farmhouse and I said, this is a new ball game.
A new game, played where people live and where people can die. The ghost has just raised the stakes. In the town of Almont, Ontario, an arsonist known as the Ghost has just tried and failed to burn down a home on the edge of town. However, when Detective Dougherty learns that the house is uninhabited, he realizes that the ghost has targeted the place intentionally, and that tells him something very important.
That property had been abandoned for 40 years. So the only person who would have the knowledge that that was abandoned was someone local.
Inside the house, Dougherty recovers a large number of flares. Not burnt out as at previous fires, but pristine specimens. Dougherty sees that they are not the common commercial variety available to car owners. Only professional emergency crews have access to this type of flare.
And so we had to take a look at this from the perspective this way. Are we dealing with a firefighter or are we dealing with a police officer?
The revelation that the arsonist may be very close to home, perhaps even a member of his fire brigade, is particularly difficult for Fire Chief Art Brown. Detective Dougherty offers Art Brown a way to find out if the ghost is a police officer or a fireman. He will put marked flares in police cars if Art Brown will do the same in his fire trucks. Art Brown hates to sneak around, hates to deceive men he holds in the highest respect, but it's the only way to rule them out.
He was more than willing to assist us, somewhat shocked that we were taking a look at his department, but tempered by the fact that we were doing the same thing with ours.
Detective Dougherty doesn't rely on the flares alone. He turns to behavioral profiler Jim Van Allen to understand the mind of the ghost.
I believe that there was something missing out of this individual's life, and the setting of the fires replaced that need for excitement that this individual had. And that would translate to somebody who is overly enthusiastic, somebody who appeared overly inquisitive, somebody who demonstrated those risk-taking behaviors. They have a need to see the damage that they've committed, and for some of them, they tend to involve themselves in the investigation as well.
As the investigation continues, so do the fires. August 26th, on the outskirts of Almont, a jogger notices a smoking hay bale. She spots a red SUV. And then she finds a flare. She immediately calls police, who take it to the fire chief.
Two of the officers came in and I knew just when they walked in my office, the look on their face, that something is wrong here. Do I want to hear what they're going to say? And we have good news and we get bad news. Good news, it is a marked flare. The bad news, it came out of your vehicles. Well, you could have hit me with the head with the sleds in.
Art Brown has to discreetly investigate all his men and create a profile for each, so that Dougherty can compare them to the profile of the arsonist.
It's hard for me to not be able to tell my fellow firefighters what is going on, and they were getting frustrated, and so it was hard on them too.
15 fires in 8 weeks. No end in sight. And still no suspect.
He was able to strike, and he just could do it so fast and get away that nobody could seem to catch him. That was the frustrating part.
The community was adamant that they could not understand why we hadn't caught this individual. And the media put pressure on us by asking the same question, why can't we catch him?
Police get an urgent call from someone claiming to have important new information. It's retired firefighter Gibby Drummond. Gibby thinks he might have seen the ghost just 2 days ago. As he put flowers on his mother's grave, he saw a truck loaded with loud teens. Later, he realized that the teens drove past him just after the start of a fire at the Gleason farm, one of the last places set ablaze. Drummond insists, "I didn't see them put a torch to it, but I would swear on a stack of Bibles. Seems pretty damn suspicious to me." But Dougherty doesn't buy Gibby's story.
If kids had been committing these fires, we would have known after fire number 1, because kids, although they have this code that they think exists, that they never tell the police, they can't help but talk and tell someone.
Gibby thinks the investigators are handling things all wrong. "We gotta work together on this. We're a team," he says. "We have to catch these guys before they kill somebody." But Dougherty now has questions about Gibby Drummond himself.
There were 50-some odd volunteers that we had conversations with every day about the fires. And no one was animated, no one was upset, no one went sideways on us, no one went nuclear, if you will. But it's Mr. Drummond on a rant that we have to catch this individual. That just was not right. It did not sit well with any of us.
An angry citizen impatient with the police? Or is Gibby Drummond trying to tell them something else? After a curious encounter with retired firefighter Gibby Drummond, Detective Dougherty asks himself, could he be a possible suspect?
He certainly satisfied our big 3. He's a current volunteer, access to flares, and certainly matches a number, if not a vast majority, of the behavioral profile.
But when he outlines his suspicions to Art Brown, the fire chief is positive he's pointing the finger at the wrong man.
I say I've known him for over 40 years. I've worked with him, fought fires with him. He got a bit excited at the time, but that's just Gibby, because he got an adrenaline rush out of fighting, and he was really great at his job.
Not just great at his job. He once saved Art Brown's life.
I went right through the roof, and I went right to the neck, and he just came down with that big hand, and he just grabbed me by the shoulder and pulled me back, pulled me right up in one shot, and he still doesn't know how he done it.
Heroism aside, there's another reason that Art Brown is convinced that Gibby could not be the ghost. 5 years ago, a terrible accident left him permanently injured.
Like, the pain was so bad that like his stomach would actually turn from the pain. And they started giving medication, and he was on so much medication.
Gibby is still haunted by that night. Up a ladder with an axe. Up a ladder in full gear to protect him from the searing heat. And at the top, a window. Behind the window, a young couple. He swings his axe and strikes the glass. Explosion. He's falling, The young couple perishes in the flames. Gibby's body lies shattered on the ground. The detective begins to reconsider his suspicions about Drummond.
You had to be physically able to go to some of the locations where we had flares recovered. Mr. Drummond, Gib Drummond, was physically incapable of doing this.
Nevertheless, Gibby Drummond, the prime suspect, is kept under 24-hour police surveillance.
Well, one of the nights that we have him under surveillance, a fire call comes in, unrelated. He goes down the street like a jackrabbit. So, contrary to what the community believed and even his family, he was not as physically incapable as he was leading everyone to believe.
Everything points to Drummond, but that's not the same thing as proof, not even close.
Because frankly, and it's terrible to say, if we were going to successfully resolve this investigation and catch this person, we needed to catch him in the act, and we needed more fires.
After 10 days of surveillance, on September 16th, police followed Drummond down a side road. Gibby Drummond, the hero, the victim, the prime suspect. For all the circumstantial evidence, for all the psychological profiling, the investigators do not know for certain Gibby Drummond is the ghost. Until now. In the first 72 hours of the investigation, police found a burnt-out flare. But it took 10 weeks to connect the flares to Gibby Drummond, who was hiding in plain sight all along. They read him as rights in front of his second car, a red SUV. It's a shock to the community, but especially to Art Brown.
These guys become part of your family. You know, you share so much together. You know, and it's very hard to accept that someone would do this to you.
Art Brown now realizes what his friend has done and how he did it. Gibby would light the flares, knowing he had time to get back home and wait for the radio call to announce his own fires. Arriving at the scene, Gibby would help out any way he could, sharing with his comrades the adrenaline of the moment. It was something he needed, his own mock heroics to compensate for his tragic failure the night the young couple died. In the end, he betrayed everyone he knew.
I gotta separate my profession from my friendship, which is hard. You know, say time heals, but...
When he pleaded guilty, he begged forgiveness of the court and his family and firefighters everywhere, but he didn't mention the victims, which I thought he might have.
Haunted by his own demons, Gibby Drummond had terrorized the people of Almont for the last time. He was charged and pled guilty to 8 counts of arson. He remains in prison to this day.